of Canada's tragic birth certificates is that it cast Aboriginal people into the role of the savage and cast itself into the role of the civilized. And that has allowed government after government to get away with the inequitable and unjust treatment of Indigenous people in this country.
This is a story about children. This is a story about what our country, through its laws and policies in a legal way, did that damaged generations of children.
We know that when 3 kids walked in one school, only 1 walked out alive.
Basically, you've got a tuberculosis generating factory in some of these schools.
He knows how many children are dying in residential schools, and nobody cared. Aboriginal people were irrelevant.
What is heroic about doing the right thing? What is heroic about doing what you should be doing?
My mom never talked about it because the poor guy was in disgrace.
When my mother passed away, she left me with a family treasure. I found my great-grandfather. I've spent much of my life as a journalist, telling other people's stories. And when I opened that box, I realized that I had the best story of my life, and I'd almost missed it. I went on the road to see what my great-grandfather might have seen, to visit the place where he was born, and where his parents are buried. In 1843, Peter Bryce's father George and mother Catherine came to Mount Pleasant from Scotland. George and Catherine emigrated with George's brothers, who then moved to the United States. But he stayed and set up a blacksmith's shop in Mount Pleasant, a thriving agricultural community with ready access to markets in the U.S. George and Catherine Bryce raised 7 children and sent 4 of them to university. The house they built is still standing, and current owner Betty Bannister gave me a copy of the original agreement between George Bryce and the builder, dated 1853.
They spent $310 to build this house. Wow.
Across the road stands Mount Pleasant Presbyterian Church, the center of Peter Bryce's childhood. Inside the church, a stained glass window depicts the story of the Good Samaritan, and the dedication, in loving memory of George Bryce and Catherine Henderson, his wife. I am struck with a sense of having returned to a place I've never really been to.
Hi, Adam.
Hi, Andy.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you. Come on in.
Dr. Adam Green is a researcher for the federal government and history professor at the University of Ottawa. He links Bryce's faith to his role in a movement called the social gospel.
You cannot understand Canada and the evolution of what became 20th century Canada without understanding the social gospel. It is, if you want to talk about the arc of Canada from the time of its founding as a dominion to what it became, the social welfare state of the 1940s and onwards, the social gospel is what ties those two things together. And Peter Bryce really is right in the middle of all of that. So religion for the average Canadian, in the late 19th century is the centerpiece of their life in a way that I think we don't even understand today. People got their identity from their religion.
My great-grandfather attended University College in Toronto, where he completed high school and went on to earn a bachelor's, a master's, and then his medical degree. In 1880, he was granted his qualification as a surgeon in Edinburgh, Scotland, and then studied in Paris, where he worked with the leading neurologists of the time. Public health was a relatively new field when Peter Bryce and Oliver Mowat, the Premier of Ontario, began drafting legislation in 1882. This legislation introduced the foundational concepts of public health, that decisions should be evidence-based, that action needs to be taken quickly to head off health problems, and that public health should be available to all. In 1884, he wrote the first public health legislation for Ontario, and his work was adopted by all provinces in Canada and many states in the United States. We have clean drinking water, septic systems, and mandated vaccination programs because of my great-grandfather and the people he worked with. My search for Peter Bryce had led me to family members who I hadn't seen since I was a child.
How are you?
Come on in. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you too. Let's have a...
Ellie Kerr was one of those people, and she was one of the few people alive who had memories of Peter Bryce.
There you are.
Yeah. I don't look very pleasant, do I? Almost pouting. Shame.
I have another picture of you here. It's kind of a grumpy face, but there's a face there.
No wonder Margaret started telling stories about me being grumpy as a kid. That's 2 grumpies now. That's my grandfather. Yeah. Only me at that time. And he took me into this tomato patch and started talking about gardens and tomatoes and stuff. And that was so interesting. And he was so nice to do that. I even remember that, it was interesting. He took time to teach me. Mm-hmm. And not everybody would do that. And he was a kind guy.
Yeah. One of the keepsakes left behind by Peter Bryce is this grandfather clock. It's now owned by my cousin, David Bryce. The clock was presented to my great-grandfather by his staff the day he left the Ontario provincial government in 1904.
He was the first chief medical officer of health in North America. So he didn't have the title. If you look there, it says Secretary of the Board of Health. That's what he was called in legislation that he helped write.
He was moving to the federal bureaucracy, where he would have an opportunity to create and enforce national health standards. He must have been excited at the prospect. But 1904 marks the beginning of the most difficult period in Peter Bryce's career. That's when he began gathering information on the health of children in residential schools. There were at least 139 federally funded, church-run residential schools in Canada. The schools were run by churches and funded by the federal government. Students would be taken from their homes and sent to school, often many kilometers away, sometimes for years. In the spring of 1907, Dr. Bryce traveled to the prairies and visited 35 residential schools. He reported that 24% of all children in residential schools had died or were sick with tuberculosis, an infectious disease which usually attacks the lungs and is fatal. Victims suffer from long bouts of coughing and physically waste away.
Bryce comes back and writes his report and says, the Aboriginal population is dying of tuberculosis. In particular, they are dying at far higher rates than the average Canadian population, in some places as high as 20 times as often. The common assumption has been that it's something endemic to being Aboriginal or their communities that is causing this. Bryce says, it's plain and simple, it has nothing to do with that. Tuberculosis is not by any means been cured here, but there is something known about preventing its spread. And basically you've got almost a tuberculosis generating factory in some of these schools. Some of the worst ones have over 90% of the student population have tuberculosis.
My scar is deep. My scar started at the age of 5.5. Walking up the stairs and meeting the father of that church, him patting me on top of the head after I greeted him and saying, "Okie napi," because he was a male, so I said, "Hello, my friend." I never knew about hell, but that's where hell started for me. Everything inside of me died. They tried to kill the Indian and the child. What they damn near succeeded was to kill the human being in that child.
I lost my innocence I lost my dignity. I lost my pride. I was beaten. I was told that I was stupid, dumb, lazy, ugly, that I was a savage. I didn't learn a thing. I didn't learn anything in that school.
The Indian residential schools, not everybody was sexually abused. Not everybody was physically abused. But we were all spiritually abused. I talk about my experience because I want to get my power back, and I want to give the shame back to this person that abused me.
Well, here we are.
Megan Sproul-Jones is a writer who found Peter Bryce while cataloging files at the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs.
When Peter Bryce entered the civil service, I think he did have a reputation. He was extremely well known for the work that he had done in Ontario as Secretary of the Provincial Health Board, writing the Public Health Acts for Ontario, which were then used as a model for all of the other provinces in Canada. For him, though, the challenge would have been confronting other realities, the economic realities of governing the nation as a whole. He had to report to many people above him whose interests were less concerned about the Indigenous Canadians, more concerned about economic prosperity. There was a huge push for immigration, to get immigrants out onto the prairies to start farming and establishing communities there. Those interests were at the forefront of the government's agenda of the day. So for a man coming in trying to push public health, it would have been a challenge for him to have his voice heard in the same way that he had succeeded at the provincial level.
Dr. John Malloy has written what one critic called the definitive book on the Indian residential school system.
I mean, here's a guy that comes in from outside the department with an incredible reputation, an incredible set of skills, and public adulation, if you could call it that, right? And he runs into Duncan Campbell Scott, who's not going to have any contradictions, and Duncan can't afford any contradictions. I mean, Duncan Campbell Scott's in the office stamping his feet, saying, you know, somebody get the churches off my neck, right? Every time they show up in the minister's office, they bring a bishop with them. I say we can't afford that, or it's not a good idea to do, and the politicians look at them and says, the bishop brings me how many votes? How many votes do you bring me?
Throughout my early research, I had seen references to Peter Bryce's file at the National Archives. I wanted to look into why my great-grandfather found it so difficult to move public health concerns forward.
Here we go. There's not much in here. That's very interesting. This just doesn't feel right. It feels really heavily redacted and vetted to me. I can't believe there's nothing from Indian Affairs here. There's nothing. This file's been like really heavily vetted. I can't believe this. He was notified by then Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, so that would be Duncan Campbell Scott, that he would no longer be required to perform the duties of medical inspector of the department. Wow.
He was the person who received your great-grandfather's report and turned the other way and started to discredit your great-grandfather.
6 months after Bryce delivered his report, it was leaked to the press. Retaliation came soon after. Bryce was denied permission to present his findings at conferences, and his work was suppressed. In 1913, Bryce was relieved of his duties at Indian Affairs.
Duncan Campbell Scott wanted to be a doctor, just like your great-grandfather. And he didn't have the money to go to education, so he ends up getting a job as a clerk at Indian Affairs, appointed by Sir John A. Macdonald himself, by the way. And he rises through the ranks there, and he becomes a father, and by all accounts was a loving father. We have him playing the violin. We know that he was writing those poems that he wrote. But on the flip side of that, when he would go to the office, this was a guy that was prepared to make any decision to hold the public purse string strong. So when your great-grandfather walked in with that report saying, hey, these kids are dying and there's something we can do about it, Duncan Campbell Scott was faced with a $10,000 to $15,000 bill to save those kids, and he wouldn't pay it. I think that says something about the man, you know? It's a weird thing where he would go home to his own loving daughter and yet turn his back on paying $10,000 to save thousands of kids back then. But his own daughter tragically dies of scarlet fever when she's 12 years old. She was sent off to boarding school in Paris, and she dies there, and she's buried with him over there. And so I've always said to people, I think it's a mistake to make Duncan Campbell Scott an evil villain and discard him into history that way, because he's much like many people today, where you have this person who's seen as an outstanding citizen making bad decisions in the public service because they're either too afraid or they think that they mistake the loyalty to the government as being loyalty to the public. And sometimes those are two different things, and you have to have the courage to stand up when that happens. Duncan Campbell Scott was too afraid.
From 1913 until 1920, Peter Bryce worked for the Department of Immigration and was instrumental in drafting legislation to create a federal Ministry of Public Health. Bryce expected he'd be offered the deputy minister's position, but he was passed over, and a few months later, bitterly disillusioned, forced to retire. But once in retirement, Bryce was free from his oath of confidentiality, and in 1922, published a revealing book about his time in Indian Affairs. He laid the blame on both the churches and the federal government, underlining how the federal government failed to ensure adequate funding for health and education for Indigenous children. But the book had little impact, and nothing changed. Bryce's work disappeared for almost 100 years. 10 years after publishing The Story of a National Crime, Peter Henderson Bryce bought a ticket to the West Indies. In the previous 9 months, he'd lost his wife, his brother, and his son Henderson. His son, the former head of surgery at Vancouver General Hospital, had died of tuberculosis. On January 14, 1932, Peter Bryce's body was found in his cabin on the steamship the Empress of Australia. I had been following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and learned that the commission used Peter Bryce's statistics to show the government had scientific evidence of unimaginable mortality rates.
Tuberculosis.
Recognition of my great-grandfather widened. Philanthropist and surgeon Dr. Michael Dan donated $10 million to the University of Toronto to create the Wakibinis Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health. Dr. Dan believed Bryce's methodical research and courageous actions needed to be recognized by the university where Bryce got his education. At the naming ceremony, 40 descendants of Peter Bryce showed up to take part in the event. As an act of reconciliation, Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa decided to honor Peter Bryce with an historical plaque. The hearts planted at Bryce's grave were previously planted by survivors, dignitaries, and children at the closing ceremonies of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
For Dr. Bryce.
I worked with my family to sum up my great-grandfather's contributions. Peter Henderson Bryce, 1853 to 1932. He documented health abuses and high death rates in the residential school system as early as 1907. He was subsequently removed from the Department of Indian Affairs, but decades later he was recognized as a courageous and early advocate of universal standards in health and social issues.
He made it plain that not everyone was bad and evil and that there were people trying to do good and right things, to personify the fact also that not all white people are bad, that things are not racially narrowly defined, and that there's goodness in all of us. I thank you because this is such a profound expression of reconciliation. And to Dr. Bryce, I say, we remember you, we honor you, and we thank you. Masicho.
I think that it gives him his due. You know, my great-grandfather was a remarkable man, not just because of the residential school story. In many, many different ways, he had a lot of impact. And he left a legacy in my family of education, obviously, but he left a legacy of people who are forthright and speak their minds and always stand up for what is right.
When you hear about people who took a risk and who did something and who pushed against power and authority and spoke the truth as he knew it, I think that can inspire all of us as adults to say, what can I do? What is my pathway to be able to do such a thing?
I wish my parents were here so I could tell them the story of Peter Bryce. I wonder how many other stories are waiting to be told, hidden away in cardboard boxes, libraries, and archives. I wonder how many other unsung heroes may have disappeared forever.